Hello again everybody, and continuing with my theme of the history of the early church. So far I've considered how the church came into being in the first place, what it was like in its very earliest days, some of the challenges it met over events such as attacks from the Jewish authorities, attacks from the Roman authorities in 64 AD, perhaps again under Domitian, leading ultimately to the martyrdom of St. Clement and the establishment, and under him perhaps the establishment of some sort of central authority in Rome. But I haven't really considered the question yet of what it actually meant to be a Christian. So that's the subject of my talk today. So what was actually involved in being a Christian, and what did Christians actually do? And that's not as simple a question as it might seem. We take for granted nowadays there's a core set of beliefs, there's a core set of texts on which Christianity is based, there are long centuries of tradition. Well, by the beginning of the 2nd century, none of that existed. The idea of a church with authority invested in a hierarchy within a church, that didn't really exist either, although it was beginning to, perhaps, as we've seen with the example of St. Clement. No basic creed existed, no New Testament as the Word of God existed. Neither of those are established. Well, the idea of the canon of the New Testament till late 2nd century perhaps, and the first creed didn't occur until the beginning of the 4th. So, what did Christians do, and what did they actually think? Now, the Roman writer Pliny is a key witness here. In his letter to Trajan about the Christians, about which I've spoken before, he says he thinks that they might engage in crime and abominations. Now, we hear a little bit later about what this might involve, and that was a suspicion of incest and infanticide and cannibalism. Eusebius, the church historian, late 3rd, early 4th centuries, quoting earlier events under Marcus Aurelius in a persecution that happened in Lyon in France. But when Pliny came to question Christians, he found that on a fixed day, presumably Sunday, they met before dawn, they sang a hymn antiphonally, so one side then the other side, to Christ as God, interesting. They swore collectively not to commit any crime, not to betray a trust, and not to refuse the return of money which had been borrowed. They part, then they come together later for a meal, a collective meal of ordinary food, rather than, let's say, dead babies, as was alleged later. We don't know quite what he meant by that. It could be a Eucharist, or it could be simply a collective meal, which later Christians came to call agape. Pliny then tortured a couple of slave girls, and rather than, don't fall into the trap of thinking he was vicious in doing this, it was perfectly standard Roman practice under Roman law. Slaves could not be relied upon to tell the truth unless you tortured them. It didn't seem to have worked out that tortured people will tell you what you want to hear rather than what they actually know. But the interesting thing about that is that he tortured slave girls who revealed that they were perhaps what nowadays we would call deaconesses. And he found nothing more. But that does reveal something about a church hierarchy, and that slaves were involved in that. You didn't have to be free, and that slave girls. So both women and slave status people were involved in some sort of positions of authority in the very earliest church, which is perhaps not what you might think. Now, assuming all this is true, and why would it not be, since Pliny is essentially a hostile witness, what do we have? We have collective worship, we've got high moral standards, we've got some sort of church hierarchy involving women, but not much evidence about the belief of individuals. Now, we know from other writers around about this time who were arguing against what's called Gnosticism, which it comes from the Greek word gnosis, which means knowledge, that there were certainly factions within the church and around the church had a belief that you needed some sort of secret knowledge really to belong, and that this secret knowledge existed. Now, the idea of Gnosticism predates Christianity. It was lingering around Judaism, lingering certainly around Greek philosophical traditions before Christianity came along. But it seems that that had an influence in certainly late 1st century, early 2nd century beliefs. There are warnings against this in various of Paul's letters, and especially in the Epistle of Jude. And Gnosticism came to be sidelined more or less effectively during the 2nd century AD. There was also a collective sense of care for each other in the community. It's described by Celsus, a hostile Roman witness in 180 AD. This involved care for widows, orphans, prisoners, victims of disaster. And also there was a collective burial club following pagan models on the same sort of lines. We know that Christians came to bury themselves in, well, not bury themselves, but bury each other in catacombs, and there's a separate video on catacombs. Hospitality was clearly important too. But what did the Christians actually think? Very difficult to say at this stage, but St. Clement, Clement's knowing of books eventually regarded as canonical in the New Testament, gives us some sort of idea. The core beliefs coalescing around the epistles of Paul. Pliny shows more in what he said. But it's not until the Council of Nicaea under the Emperor Constantine, the early 4th century, that a creed, the Nicene Creed, was actually established. And the fact of that council needing to be there shows the variation in beliefs. Around 150 AD, Justin Martyr, another Christian writer, tells of a Christian practice involving readings of memoirs of the apostles, maybe the proto-versions of the Gospels, and Old Testament prophets, a sermon by the episkopos, the bishop or the presbyter, a kiss of peace, a prayer over bread and wine as the body and blood of Christ, which was then distributed to those present and also to the prisoners and the sick who couldn't be present at the service. And we need to remember that Justin Martyr was an intellectual brought up in the Greek philosophical tradition. So perhaps more important in the minds and beliefs of ordinary Christians was this idea of the community. So at the centre of it all we have collective worship, collective support of the community, even collective care at burials. So perhaps we could say that much more important than the individual belief was actually the group belief of the early Christian church.